Most people familiar with the death of Officer John O'Keefe are at least vaguely familiar with the name Colin Albert. He was Brian Albert's 17-year-old nephew. He was inside 34 Fairview that night. And for reasons that I want to explore today, determining exactly when Colin left that house has somehow become one of the most fiercely defended details in the entire case. You'd expect that with our modern tools and technology like cell phones and GPS tracking, metadata, geofences and tower dumps and Celebrite extractions, there would be concrete evidence 6 ways from Sunday. Plus, all that testimony under oath, under the pains and penalties of perjury. Colin Albert's testimony during Karen Reed's first trial occupies approximately 1 hour and 48 minutes of the trial channel's edited video, with the sidebars and breaks removed. I went through that testimony and I separated Colin's answers by examiner, and I tallied up several of his favorite responses. This was an exercise designed by Satan specifically for people with short attention spans, so I will give myself a tiny margin of error here. But these are my totals. Across his testimony, Colin said no approximately 96 times. Nope, 32 times. I don't know, or I do not know, 9 times. I do not recall, once. And some variation of I don't remember or I do not remember approximately 40 times. That's roughly 178 negative, non-knowledge, or non-memory responses during his 108 minutes of testimony. Breaking it down further, I counted approximately 54 of those responses during questioning by the prosecution and 124 during questioning by the defense. So, if, like the jurors, your primary exposure to Colin Albert came through his testimony, you could be forgiven for reaching the conclusion that Colin Albert does not appear to know, recall, or remember very much at all. But before we get into the actual evidence surrounding Colin, I want to show you something else. The way that Colin has been presented to the public may be almost as interesting as the evidence itself. In June of 2023, journalist Gretchen Voss conducted an extraordinarily long interview with Karen Reed. The transcript is 227 pages. Colin Albert's name appears 31 times. Later, Gretchen Voss published her Boston Magazine feature, and the finished article is dramatically shorter, around 22 pages, but proportionally, Colin actually occupies more of it. By my analysis, Colin-related material represents roughly 7 to 8% of the interview transcript, but approximately 12 to 13% of the final published feature. In other words, Gretchen Voss didn't simply edit Colin out, she basically gave him double the real estate. But she changed what kind of Colin story the readers received in a way that makes it clear where her allegiances lie. In my opinion, of course, because the interview contains 2 very different categories of information about Colin. The first concerns Karen's belief that there had been prior friction between Colin and John. The second concerns the investigation itself, and it is that second category that largely disappears. Karen doesn't begin the interview by announcing that Colin killed John. Karen isn't even the one to initiate the topic. And since we have access to Karen's direct words, I feel a responsibility to share them with you because I don't want to summarize and risk accidentally mischaracterizing her message. But I will probably skip a lot of the Gretchen parts because she's just active listening, saying things like, I see, oh, things that are natural in conversation but are kind of disruptive when we're reading through a transcript. The other adjustment I'll make is that if there's inappropriate language, I'll substitute it out in case you're listening to this at work or in case you have young kids in the car with you. So Gretchen asks, in general, what kind of person was John? Is he like a fun guy? Was he serious? And Karen responds, he had a really great sense of humor. He didn't have the bravado that a stereotypical cop has. No ego, no pretension. He was frugal. He was just a regular guy. And I think that if his personal life wasn't complicated by what happened to his family, he'd be more relaxed. And remember, Karen knew him before and after the tragedy of what happened to his sister and his brother in law. So I don't think that it's inappropriate for her to share the observation of kind of before and after. And then she continues and says, but he would get frustrated easily. But when he was present and relaxed, he was a lot of fun. I don't know of him ever to mistreat anyone, or I don't know of anyone that, with an exception, who ever had an issue with him. And Gretchen asks, who's the exception? And Karen replies, the exception is Colin Albert. And then Gretchen probes and says, well, tell me a little bit about that. And Karen explains, so when I started dating John early in 2020, we were sleeping one night. I want to say it was April or May of 2020, and John's phone started going off with his Ring alerts that there was activity setting off the Ring cameras. And he had two. He had one over his garage and he had one at the front door. And John jumped out of bed and said, if it's that freaking Albert kid, I'm gonna lose it. And John goes out the front door, down the steps that from the second floor to the first floor of the house, which kind of leads to the front door. And now John's got like boxer shorts on, no shirt, and I'm following behind him because now I'm looking out the front window and I can see that there's kids congregated on John's front lawn. John goes out to the front steps and says, get out of my yard. They were literally not adjacent to the yard, they were in the front yard. And they all had backpacks. And they looked high school age. And Colin Albert, who I didn't know who he was at the time, but I learned within about 2 minutes who he was, yelled a string of expletives at John. Go F yourself, F off, go F yourself. And now John, he might have said something back. I don't think John swore, but maybe he said, get the F out of here. Now at this point, John's nephew had come out of bed. The front door's open, the lights are on, and there's screaming going on in the vestibule of the front door. And the nephew comes, and he's behind me on the stairs. It probably lasted a minute, this verbal altercation. But John comes back in, and I said, who the heck is that? And he said, that's that Albert kid that lives a couple doors down. When John and he said, he's a stinker, we'll say. He's an effing punk. And, John complained about him for a couple of minutes and he said, this happens. He's just a freaking hothead. Then in the morning, John and I went out and there was all Bud Light cans in this cluster of bushes on the front corner of John. Well, John was on the main street and a side street, and there was like a dozen empty Bud Light cans. So what we realized they were doing is they would drink at a house on the other side of John, and then when the party got busted up or the parents came home, rather than Colin walking to his parents' house. Now, Colin's only 16 at this time. I've learned now that he was only 16 at the time. Rather than walking in, probably drunk or buzzed with a bunch of Bud Light cans, they would just drop their trash in John's yard between houses where the party was and where he was going for the night. There was more than one incident that the same thing happened again, but by the time John opened the front door, as soon as John opened the front door, this was maybe a month later, they ran out. There wasn't really an exchange. Then, and Gretchen interrupts and asks, how did John know who he was, like Colin Albert? And Karen replies, everyone in Canton, the people we were around, they all knew each other. There was, when you drove by your neighbors, you stopped and talked. The Julie and Chris, now, Chris owned this pizza place that was right in the middle. I'll call it Main Street, but it's Washington Street. Everyone knew who he was, and every time that Julie drove by, she'd yell something at John. They called him Mr. Nebercracker, which is, I don't know the movie. It's some Disney or Pixar movie where there's a grouchy old kind of get off my lawn guy. And when I met Julie, now I would wave to Julie when I'd see her because John lived at a stop sign. So everyone who lived deep in the neighborhood all kind of filtered in and out in front of John's property. When I met Julie formally for the first time on January 22nd of 2022, which, you guys, that's like literally 7 days before John's death, she said, oh, I've got to show you something funny. Look at how we saved John's contact in my phone. And it was the name Nebercracker, Cracker. And it was a cartoon character of this old curmudgeon-y man. So after these incidents with Colin, John and I went away. We were in Florida visiting our friends, and we were no sooner at the baggage claim, having landed in Florida, when John gets a text that I believe was from Julie, and it was them drinking Bud Lights, holding them up like this on John's front steps. So John's ring went off that there was somebody on the front steps, and they also took a selfie, like taunting John. And Gretchen asks, wait, this is Colin or Julie? And Karen says, this is Julie, his mother, and Chris, his father, middle-aged parents. So this was what I realize is they're not apologetic for their son. They're kind of annoyed that John has had words with this kid. And Gretchen says, so that was sent in like a funny way or like, and Karen says, yeah, funny, but kind of like, and then Alan Jackson interrupts and he provides some context and spelling of Nebercracker. And then Karen continues, that's how he was saved in Colin Albert's mother's phone. And she, when I first met her, that was the first thing that she told me. She goes, get a load of this. Does John tell you what we call him? And I said, no. And she said, he's Mr. Nebercracker. And this is at a table full of adults. And she's passing this around. Look at how we saved John in the phone. And Gretchen asks Karen to try to interpret the tone of the interaction. So Gretchen says, and is this like friendly or is this like passive aggressive? Like, what's going on here? And Karen replies, I found it odd that a woman my age, a little bit older, I was offended for John, that they were making fun of him because I just find him so agreeable and docile, and it felt a little antagonistic, not aggressively so, but it's not a flattering analogy. And then David Unetti chimes in, but ultimately Gretchen says, yeah, and as a mother of sons who have been that age, I mean, that's ridiculous. Like if my kid did that, I would not be okay. Not be okay. And then Gretchen continues and she says, well, from what I hear, I have acquaintances in Canton. That's sort of the way. Like, it's sort of like letting your kids, they're friends with their kids. Everyone's drinking together, which I find interesting. And Karen says, yeah, I didn't grow up like that. We didn't socialize with each other's parents. We also didn't call each other's parents by their first names. I noticed like generational shifts that John's kids, when I met them, they were 9 and 12 and referring like, "Oh, that's Jen, and that's Carrie, and that's Sue, and that's Kate." And I'm like, "Wait, are those your friends? Those are their parents? You don't call them Mrs. Jones?" And actually, I had noticed in Karen's phone extraction in her Celebrate report, she actually had Peggy O'Keefe saved as Mrs. O'Keefe in her phone. So I think that it's nice to match up what she's saying here is also indicative of like she walked the walk and talked the talk. This isn't just lip service here. She truly even continued to refer to John's mom as Mrs. O'Keefe out of that same generational respect that she was describing here. But then the lawyers kind of jump in to clarify that this is the new normal. So David Yannetti, who has kids that are around that age, he's like, "Yeah, my kids, they do the first name thing too, blah, blah, blah." And Gretchen says, "So it sounds like, so from the first time that, that incident with Colin, there had been history there. So had he been doing that for a while?" And Karen replies, "Yeah, in the early summer of 2020, the kids were still remote schooling and the nephew had a break at lunch, so I made him lunch. John was at work and the nephew and the nephew's name, by the way, it's redacted out. Karen was using his actual name. I'm the one that's saying nephew out of respect for his privacy. Okay. So John was at work and the nephew and I played Frisbee in the backyard. John had speakers in his backyard, so we would the nephew and I had our own playlist, songs that he and I both liked, and we'd try to see how many volleys we could have without dropping the Frisbee. And we had the music on, but not blasting. And this is like 11:30 on a June day. And then the nephew's sister comes to me and says, "One of the neighbors is saying that you need to turn that off, or they're going to turn it off for you." And I said, "Who?" And she goes, "You don't know them." And I'm like, "But I but we know everybody. What neighbor that knows your number is texting you? And do they know that I'm the adult here and that they're threatening to come turn it off?" And she said, "You don't know them. You don't know them. Just forget it." And she was a little dismissive, and then John came home, and I think I brought it up. I said, "John, who's the neighbor she's talking about that got annoyed that nephew and we were outside for 20 minutes? It's elementary school lunch. I mean, it's about 18 minutes." And John said to his niece, "Don't tell me that's Colin Albert. It's Colin Albert?" And the niece, she got all red in the face and said, "No, no." And he said, "I want to see your phone." And she goes, "I erased it. It was a Snapchat. It's gone." And he said, "Don't even tell me that's Colin Albert." And I don't know for sure who it was, but it seems like it was. We knew all the other kids in the neighborhood, especially the ones that would have had the niece's contact. And Gretchen asks, "So did he ever talk to the parents about Colin, or did you guys discuss that night at all? Did it come up?" And Karen says, "No, no, John would just laugh it off. He didn't get defensive. I felt like they were taking advantage of John's personality, but no, I never really heard him. He didn't act like we didn't talk about Colin any other time except when it was brought up, the Nebercracker on the phone and Colin in the front yard and the time with the Frisbee. But it wasn't something that John discussed like it was bothering him. I think he just looked at him as this teenage kid, and he's a stinker. So to me, it feels like Karen is being careful in her words to relay her observations. She doesn't claim to know that Colin sent that message. She says John's immediate reaction was to wonder if it was Colin. And Karen also describes something that I find particularly revealing because, according to her, Chris and Julie Albert eventually made a joke out of John's complaints, a kind of running joke that made John a punchline. And yet, Karen simultaneously sort of minimizes the seriousness of the hostility. She tells Gretchen that John didn't obsess over Colin. He didn't talk about the conflict as if it was consuming him. He just basically regarded Colin as an obnoxious teenager. And I feel like it's important to call attention to those nuances. Karen isn't describing some like blood feud. She's just describing reoccurring neighborhood friction. And I just feel like she's actually careful not to make it more melodramatic than that. Most of those nuances disappear, though, from Gretchen's final article. The published story compresses the history into essentially one big long confrontation, profanity, Bud Light cans found the next morning, and that therefore, Karen's conclusion that there was forever thereafter bad blood. Gone are the several details that would help readers to evaluate the allegations themselves. John's alleged recognition of Colin before he even went outside, and his confirmation upon returning. Gone is the second overnight incident, the Frisbee incident, the Nebercracker joke, the parents on the steps photograph, and Karen's own perspective that John largely regarded Colin as a teenage nuisance rather than some kind of mortal enemy. That alone would be, I guess, ordinary magazine editing. I mean, a 227-page interview has to be reduced and compressed. But the editing becomes more interesting when you look at something else that disappeared almost entirely from Gretchen's retelling of the story. During the interview, Karen's attorneys gave Gretchen an entirely different reason that they considered Colin important. According to Alan Jackson, Colin Albert never mentioned once, and Jackson describes Colin as effectively non-existent in the investigative reports. The defense eventually demanded that he be brought before the grand jury, and then David Yannetti tells Gretchen something even more specific. According to Yannetti, when he asked prosecutor Adam Lally to call Colin, Lally told him that Colin wasn't there that night and questioned why Colin should testify. Yannetti says 4 additional witnesses subsequently acknowledged that Colin had in fact been inside 34 Fairview that night. Think about how different that question is from, did Colin and John have bad blood? You don't have to believe Karen Reed's theory. You don't have to believe that Colin assaulted anyone. You don't even have to believe the lawn story. The investigative question stands on its own. How is someone who was admittedly present inside the house completely omitted from the initial investigative record? And yet somehow we had the Sullivan sisters from the Aruba incident? When was Colin's presence established, and who established it? What information changed, and why? Those questions are largely absent from the published discussion, and so is another detail. Karen told Gretchen about an alleged 12:33 a.m. call from Colin to 16-year-old Erin Beatty. And again, let me read you the exact words because I want you to be able to evaluate precisely what words that were used. So on page 187, David Yannetti says, and before court started, Lally took me into the common foyer and said, he goes, Dave, no, I got this letter and, we've already put in Brian Albert and Brian Higgins. I mean, but Colin Albert, he goes, he wasn't there that night. Like, why would I call him? Do you have any information for me? And I being David Yannetti, said, Adam, I'm just telling you he has information and we're asking you to put him in. He goes, so you're not going to tell me anything? And I said, no, I've already told you in the letter. And then for the first time after that, I think 3 witnesses testified after that date. And that's when Karen pops in and says 4. And David Unetti says 4, that Colin Albert was there that night. And Karen pops in again. In my opinion, it must have felt so good to finally have someone, like a reporter, receiving their side of the story. It must have been tough not to interrupt. In fact, there are many times throughout this section where it almost seems like they're all kind of clamoring over each other at the opportunity to finally share what they've been holding in. So Karen says his own parents and Brian and Nicole Albert. So Brian, Nicole, Chris, and Julie. And then David Yannetti wonders out loud, where did we get that information about Colin? And Karen says, Tom Beattie and Steve Scanlon. And then the group discusses how information was basically trickling in at that point and how the people who lived in the town were timid. And of course, timid is inside of the word intimidated. The people had been made timid because of the dynamics surrounding the situation. So Gretchen asks when the shift happens to people finally starting to open up. And Karen says, I had a few contacts, a limited few. I had 5. The Carrens, who John and I were very close with, Tom Beattie, who's a single dad of 2 teenage daughters. He told our investigator early innings, probably about February 4th, Paul, and she's not talking about Paul O'Keefe, she's talking about Paul Mikowski, the PI that works for David Yannetti. Okay, so Paul Mikowski was at his house, and because Paul was saying, who can I talk to? And I said, well, these are all the people that we were with. Most people wouldn't answer the door, but Tom, genuinely wanting to get to the bottom of this, did engage with my PI, as did the Currans. They spoke with him briefly. And Tom said, all I know about 34 Fairview that night is there was underage drinking going on. I know that for a fact. He said, my daughter was invited to drink over there and she didn't go. At 12:33, her phone rang. 12:33 a.m., January 29th, her phone rang. And when she woke up, I said, Colin Albert was calling your phone. Tom doesn't care for Colin Albert, and he said, what is that? What is that silly head doing calling you with that? And she, being the daughter, goes, I don't know. And Tom goes, well, I want you to call him right now, and I want to hear him explain why he's calling my 16-year-old's phone at 12:33. And she actually sent him a Snapchat, which we don't have evidence of except her own words. And she said, what was up last night? What were you calling for? And he wrote back, according to Erin on Snapchat, which disappears, never mind, all good. So, and Tom is not dramatic or looking to insert himself. He just genuinely cared for John and is skeptical about all these circumstances he's reading about. And he said, Colin was there. And as soon as he said that, he told my investigator, who told David, who told me, and I said, well, that's interesting because John didn't have issues with anyone except one. And I mean, across the town, across the department, across the Alberts, the McCabe's, the Reeds, anyone. And that was this 16-year-old kid that told John to go F himself in front of his adopted children. I said, so you're telling me that Colin was there? And that's the punk down the street who drinks on a Sunday and dumps his beers in the bushes of this guy's house? And then David got a call from somebody using an alias saying John was beaten up by Brian Albert, and the nephew didn't name him but said the nephew. And then Mr. Yannetti interrupts her and says, oh, that was the day of your, and Karen says, oh, that was February 2nd. Yeah. And then David Yannetti says, I got an anonymous call. Yeah. Well, he gave me a name, but it was a fake name, but we later identified him. And Karen continues, he said they broke his nose. He said that when John didn't come to, Brian and a federal agent dumped his body on the front lawn. And from there, they describe a bit more about the tipster, but they're cautious. They stop themselves before saying anything else that could identify him, and they even tell Gretchen Voss, like, "I don't want the description. I don't want for Brian Albert, to read that and go, 'It's so and so.'" Because remember, nobody expected that the court would compel a reporter's raw interview notes and transcripts. I mean, has that ever even happened before? The fact that Gretchen Voss is clearly informed about the 12:33 a.m. situation and doesn't include this detail in the article doesn't establish anything sinister, but it is certainly relevant when a published article later presents the approximately 12:10 a.m. as actual evidence establishing Colin's departure time. The readers are never told that Gretchen has also been informed about an alleged communication involving Colin at 12:33. And once you realize that, you start to notice that there's a significant shift in the tone of the article. In the published feature, Gretchen examines what she calls, quote unquote, possible holes in Karen's theory. Suddenly, Colin is no longer an investigative anomaly. He becomes evidence against Karen. Gretchen publishes an exclusive interview with Colin. Colin says that he left as Brian Albert arrived, and he says that Allie McCabe drove him home. I noticed it felt like Gretchen started to assume an ever-increasing tone of authority as she reports that court documents indicate John had not yet arrived. She says that Boston Magazine reviewed text messages supporting a 12:10 pickup. Colin's parents say he remained home afterwards. Perhaps I'm being oversensitive, but it feels like the reporter has become judge, jury, and executioner here. And then comes another rebuttal because Gretchen reports that multiple people who knew John and Colin did not perceive significant bad blood between them. And two unnamed sources allegedly told her that the teenager involved in the lawn confrontation was not Colin at all. Compare that evidentiary framing. Karen's account is presented as Reed says, Reed remembers, Reed believed, Reed connected the dots. But when the rebuttal comes, it's court documents show, Boston Magazine reviewed, Colin told Boston Magazine, his parents say, multiple people say, two sources claim. And that creates a subtle hierarchy of credibility. Karen's information is framed as part of her evolving subjective theory, but Colin's rebuttal is surrounded by language that suggests external verification. And then there's another important asymmetry because Karen gave Gretchen an account containing what she described as two contemporaneous identifications that John had made himself. According to Karen, John was the one that suspected that Albert kid before going outside and then identified Colin afterward. Yet the published article doesn't give readers those details before telling them that these two unnamed sources dispute Colin's involvement in the incident and claim that it was some other unidentified neighborhood hoodlum. And so readers are deprived of the opportunity to fully weigh the competing accounts. And I can't help but wonder, when did Gretchen even interview Colin? Because remember the sequence of events. Karen's interview with Gretchen took place on June 20th and July 13th of 2023. The first, last, and only time that Colin was ever interviewed by the police was July 18th of 2023. So, it's just, to me, it's a little bit hinky. The same transformation happens with the Proctor connection. The interview contains extensive discussion of relationships between the Alberts and Michael Proctor's extended family. The published article preserves just one striking detail, Karen discovering a photograph of young Colin serving as the ring bearer at Proctor's sister's wedding. But notice the structure. The magazine article essentially gives readers Karen saw the photograph. Karen began connecting dots. Karen became suspicious of Proctor. But what the raw interview materials had actually given Gretchen was substantially different. Colin had documented family connections to Proctor's family. Colin was completely absent from the investigative record. The defense says prosecutors initially maintained Colin wasn't there at all. The defense demanded that Colin testify, and then witnesses subsequently acknowledged his presence after all. Those aren't the same narrative. Gretchen was provided with info about the chronology and conduct, but she chose to frame it as Karen Reed's thought process. And there's a subtle sense, it kind of reminds me of when doctors give you the impression that it's all in your head, you know? In the interview, Colin emerges as an unresolved investigative anomaly. But in the published article, Colin becomes a disputed component of Karen Reed's alternative theory. The first framing invites questions. Was there prior friction? Why wasn't Colin documented? When did investigators establish he'd been there? Why did the prosecutor allegedly think he wasn't there? What changed? What should we make of the alleged 1233 phone call? How significant were these family relationships? But the published article asks a different question. Does Karen Reed's theory about Colin hold up? And then Gretchen answers the question using Colin's denial and his parents' account, purportedly corroborating texts, court documents, and unnamed sources disputing the conflict. And I can't tell you why Gretchen made those editorial choices. I mean, there may be perfectly legitimate explanations. She conducted additional reporting between the interview and the publication. Information may have changed. Sources may have contradicted one another. I mean, I get it. Editors may have made decisions about length or focus or legal exposure, but whatever the explanation, the transformation is meaningful. The interview says there were several independent reasons the defense found Colin and the investigation of Colin unusual. And the article basically says Karen suspected Colin, but subsequent reporting gives readers reasons to doubt her suspicion. Those aren't simply the long version and the short version of the same story. They're like two different stories. They're different frames. Many of the underlying questions about Colin remain unresolved to this day, which brings us to why reasonable people continue asking them. And I do need to be careful here because none of the following details that I've gathered, none of the facts, allegations, discrepancies, relationships, or unanswered questions individually prove that Colin Albert harmed John O'Keefe. Some are disputed, some depend on witness accounts, some may ultimately have completely innocent explanations. My point is accumulation, because Colin is, number one, the nephew whom alleged tipster Steve Scanlon reportedly identified in the phone call with David Yannetti shortly after Karen Reed's February 2nd arraignment. Number two, Colin is the person whose presence apparently failed to appear in the original witness accounts and investigative reports. Number three, Colin is the son of a woman who literally offered a gift to lead investigator Michael Proctor 3 days after John's death. And I used to think that that wasn't a big deal, but then I noticed that gifts are specifically mentioned in the witness intimidation statute. So her proposition of a gift aligns more closely to the definition of witness intimidation than the actions that Aiden is being accused of. Number four, Colin is the member of a family so intertwined with lead prosecutor Michael Proctor's family that photographic documentation and their own words place them at weddings, barbecues, life events, and holidays together. And remember, Michael Proctor's mother referred to the Alberts as their second family, not Jillian Daniels, Proctor's sister's best friend, the Albert. And Colin appeared in seemingly professional studio photos with Michael Proctor's nephew in what appears to be 2020 or 2021. That's pretty close, right? When's the last time that your kids appeared in studio photographs with anyone besides their siblings or maybe their cousins? Number 5, Colin was a teenager appearing in photographs that have generated questions about injuries to his knuckles and his face and his eye. Number 6, Colin was the teenager whose underage drinking was hardly treated as a closely guarded family secret. Number 7, Colin was the passenger whose alleged ride home with Allie McCabe has become critically important in establishing his departure time, even more so now that Allie's GPS data indicates she was nowhere near 34 Fairview or Colin's home at all that night. Number 8, Colin was the person alleged to have called a sober 16-year-old Erin Beatty at 12:33 that morning without providing her with a clear explanation afterward. And do we have any tower data about the location where that call might have originated? Number 9, Colin was the subject of later controversy surrounding attempts to dispute or retract the Beatty account, resulting in what some have called witness intimidation, as there were adults that told Erin to stick something inappropriate in her mouth and stop talking about 12:33, while other adults pressured Tom to retract his statements about the incident. Number 10, Colin is someone who drove the same make and model of vehicle as the one that Lucky described seeing near the property in the early morning hours. Number 11, Colin was the witness who testified that he had essentially never been in fights outside of childhood fights with his brothers, despite multiple videos later circulating that appear to depict him engaged in physical fights with others and threatening physical fights with others. Number 12, Colin, who had no way of knowing the specific and detailed situations that Karen had shared with Gretchen Voss during their June interview, flat out denied having any conflict with John O'Keefe in both his July interview with the MSP and during his testimony. Let me read you the exact words from the MSP report. Colin grew up at thus and such Meadows Avenue in Canton and recalls seeing John around the neighborhood from time to time. Colin would drive by John's house to exit the neighborhood to Pleasant Street and would wave and say hi to John whenever Colin would see him. Colin stated there was never any animosity between him and John, and the two were always friendly with one another in passing. Colin stated that he never went inside John's home. The extent of their relationship was the friendly hello when passing one another. Colin could not recall ever meeting Karen Reed. Do with that what you will, right? Number 13, bear in mind, Colin was the person who was not interviewed by the Massachusetts State Police until 535 days after John's death. Number 14, Colin's interview lasted 10 minutes by his own estimate in the grand jury transcripts, and 26 minutes if we believe Michael Proctor's record of the starting time and Chris Albert's record of the ending time. Number 15, Colin's interview, again first, last, and only, generated 2 handwritten sets of investigator notes that were practically identical. Number 16, Colin was the son of adults who, in Yuri Buchanan's report, followed back to 34 Fairview on the night in question. Adults who seemingly made jokes at John's expense over the neighborhood disputes. Number 17, Colin's maternal grandfather worked alongside the future D.A. Morrissey, the future Judge Beverly Cannoni, and Judge Beverly Cannoni's father and brother, attorneys John Prescott Sr. and Jr., for literally decades. This info comes to us from a Facebook post from July 23rd, 2024, so you can decide how much credibility that you want to place on it. And the post reads, Jill Daniels and Julie Albert's dad was hit by an Amtrak train in 2008 in Canton and died in 2011. His name was John, and in parentheses it says Jack, Daniels Jr. And guess where he worked? He was a court clerk, bookkeeper, cashier in Quincy District Court for 37 years. The sisters referring to Jill Daniels and Julie, so their only brother, John J. Daniels III of Braintree, died at 38 unexpectedly in 2016. Bev's father, brother, and Bev all worked extensively in that Quincy courthouse during the same time period. There is the Bev McAlbert connection. Her dad was a prosecutor, ADA, as well as a public defense lawyer during the time period. Her brother, John Prescott Jr., and then in parentheses it says both are deceased, represented Chris Albert Sr. for his vehicular homicide hit-and-run charges that had killed a young foreign exchange student and injured the student's girlfriend, and he took off after crashing into the student's car from the rear, and he hid for 36 hours before turning himself in to police. And then it says that he only served 6 months for the killing. And of course, we can't even begin to calculate how many cases Judge Cannoni has presided over wherein Brian Albert was a witness for the Boston PD. Straying even further from fact, it's rumored that D.A. Morrissey's wife and Judge Cannoni's mother were longtime co-workers too. And let's not even get into the rumors about Judge Bev's Cape Cod Cottage connection to the McCabe's. Number 18. Colin is the son of Chris Albert, who, despite having a conflict of interest due to unpaid taxes, inexplicably ran for a local government position that granted him oversight and personal access to the police, and yet he contributed very little to the committee, even on the meeting days that he managed to attend. Number 19, Colin, who testified on a Thursday to having no social media, was back to posting on Instagram just 3 days later, while the trial was still going on. Number 20, Colin, who perhaps only even became a witness due to Aidan Carney's dogged persistence in his petitioning of the government. Number 21, Colin, who received an unprecedented televised public proclamation of innocence by D.A. Michael Morrissey himself on August 25th of 2023. Who can forget that wild hostage statement? And Colin, whom, number 22, Judge Bev Cannoni determined in her March 31st, 2025 memorandum and order would be expressly excluded from being a proposed third-party culprit during Karen Reed's retrial, which began the next day. Remember, it began on April Fool's Day. So whatever you think each individual data point means, step back and look at the picture. Why has so much energy been devoted to Colin? And why has so much energy been devoted specifically to establishing what time he left that house? There's a reason that our legal system cares about appearances. Judicial ethics do not merely ask whether a judge personally believes herself or himself capable of being fair. They also recognize an objective question. Would a reasonable observer, knowing the relevant facts, reasonably question the judge's impartiality? And that principle exists because public confidence cannot survive on, trust me, bro. Sometimes the appearance of a conflict deserves examination, even if no actual misconduct is ultimately established. And I think the same basic reasoning is useful here. When ordinary people are confronted with repeated anomalies, unexplained relationships, inconsistent accounts, unusual investigative decisions, and extraordinary public defenses of one particular person, it is perfectly rational for them to ask questions. Reasonable suspicion is not a conviction. And questions are not verdicts, and scrutiny is not harassment. The solution to reasonable questions is reasonable evidence, which is why the presentation of Colin during the trial became interesting too. Even moderately attentive viewers may have noticed repeated efforts, intentional or otherwise, that had the effect of minimizing Colin. Colin appeared in oversized clothing that made him look younger and smaller than many viewers expected. Brian Albert, during his testimony, underestimated Colin's size by several inches and roughly 30 pounds. Prosecutor Adam Lally questioned Colin using extremely simple, incremental language like third grader comprehension level. Information helpful to Colin's timeline was repeatedly front loaded into questions, walking and maybe even crossing the line into leading, and behavior that might otherwise raise questions about the reliability of the timeline was sometimes presented almost as evidence of being responsible. And that was one area that really got my goats. Consider the account involving Allie McCabe. According to the witness's own story, 17-year-old Allie was driving after the junior operator curfew and transporting teenage friends who had been drinking. So we've got the underage drinking, we've got being out past the curfew. I believe that there's also rules about how many passengers you can have in the vehicle when you have a junior operator license. And that conduct was nevertheless repeatedly embedded by Adam Lally inside this narrative in which Allie was portrayed as the responsible one, giving her friends rides home. And I mean, maybe she was trying to be helpful, but the legal irregularity also matters when we're evaluating whether these teenagers were rigidly following rules and schedules that night. And the same thing happened outside the courtroom. McAlbert supporters frequently referred to Colin as a child or minor. And I mean, technically he was a minor on the day that John died, but context matters. On January 29th, 2022, both Colin and Allie were only weeks away from their 18th birthdays. They weren't 12. They weren't elementary school kids wandering innocently through adult events. They were 17-year-olds participating in a social environment involving underage drinking, driving, parties, and other behavior that hardly reflected rigid compliance with rules, especially for student athletes. Take, for example, that photo of Colin, chest emblazoned with a tattoo of the Albert family crest, 3 full weeks before the legal age of 18 in Massachusetts, of which there are no exceptions or waivers. And that brings me to the question that I just can't shake. Why does his departure time matter so much? If Colin wasn't involved in whatever happened to John O'Keefe, and if John never entered 34 Fairview, why should Colin's precise departure time be so consequential? Seriously, what does it matter? Suppose Colin stayed until 12:20 or 12:25 or 12:30. If John never entered that house and Karen supposedly struck him outside with the Lexus, Colin could theoretically have been downstairs playing video games until sunrise. His presence inside would not make Karen guilty or innocent. So why has placing Colin outside that house before John could possibly have entered it, why does it seem so critically important? Why 12:10? Why the pickup texts? Why the testimony? Why the constant insistence that he was already gone? Why the extraordinary public proclamation that accusations involving Colin were false? Why did his timeline require so much reinforcement? And then I changed the question. Instead of asking, why are they so determined to prove Colin wasn't there? I asked, what if he was? Again, this is hypothetical. I'm not saying that Colin Albert killed John O'Keefe. I'm not saying that we know John ever entered 34 Fairview. Actually, I am willing to say that based on something else that I recently discovered in the data, but we'll address that later. I'm asking, What happens to the legal landscape if we temporarily assume something different? What if Colin was still inside? What if John came in? What if there was a confrontation? What if an intoxicated 17-year-old threw a punch or delivered a shove? What if John fell? What if he struck his head? What if nobody intended for him to die? What legal consequences would Colin actually have faced? What legal consequences would the homeowners have faced? What exposure might exist for anyone present who failed to summon medical help? And perhaps most importantly, how much did everybody really stand to lose at 12:30 a.m. on January 29th of 2022? Because once I started researching that question, I found something I did not expect. Some of the conduct ordinary people might instinctively regard as the most serious carries less legal exposure than I assumed, and other conduct potentially carries much, much more. And the consequences change dramatically depending upon one question that rarely seems to get discussed. What if John was still alive? Because if John was alive after the original injury, then the most legally consequential person in that house might not necessarily be the person who caused him to fall. It might be the people who decided what happened next. And that completely changed the way that I looked at this case. So, in part 2, we're going to build the hypothetical. Not because I'm claiming that it happened, but because I want to understand the motive everyone keeps telling us could not possibly exist. What could a 17-year-old actually have faced if an impulsive fight ended catastrophically? What could the adults around him have faced? What happens legally if an injured man is still alive and nobody calls 911? What happens if he is moved? What happens if evidence is altered? What happens if witnesses lie? What happens if an innocent woman is subsequently blamed? And what happens when one bad decision requires another and another and another for the next 4 years? Because after researching the potential exposure, I finally understood why Colin's timeline could matter so much. If the hypothetical is anywhere close to reality, Colin isn't merely another witness. He's the linchpin. Thank you for spending time with me today. You know that my goal is always to earn your endorsement via a subscribe, a like, a hype, a comment, a share. And you know I really, really appreciate you. And if you're curious about those potential legal consequences, check to make sure that your notifications are on, because the way that my research is shaping up, I don't think you're going to want to miss the next episode. So until then, take care of yourself, take care of each other, and take care of our community. I love you.